I'm bringing on our first guest. She's returning to the Katie Halper Show. You guys really loved having her on, so she's back. Dr. Asal Rod is a scholar of Middle East history. She works on research and writing related to U.S. foreign policy issues, the Middle East, and contemporary Iran. Her writing can be seen in Newsweek, The National Interest, The Independent, Foreign Policy, and more. And she has appeared as a commentator on BBC World, Al Jazeera, CNN, and NPR. She completed a PhD in history from the University of California, Irvine in 2018 and is the author of The State of Resistance, Politics, Culture, and Identity in Modern Iran. So Asal, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me back.
Of course. Wanted to ask you, before we get into what is happening right now with Iran and Israel, there's a lot of context that's been omitted from the media discussion, and you do such great media analysis. Can you fill people in on what happened before Iran engaged in this retaliatory strike?
Yeah, well, something to keep in mind is there's the sort of the acute timeline of what happened that led to that specific strike. But also there's this longer history of a shadow war between Israel and Iran. One thing that I think is important for people to know is, for instance, Israel has been carrying out assassinations of Iranian scientists and commanders, sabotage of its nuclear facilities for years, for more than a decade. And so the April 1st attack on an Iranian consulate in Damascus, in which you saw obviously the killing of multiple IRGC commanders, was not an entirely new situation, but it was sort of unprecedented because of the site, because of the location of the attack, which was an Iranian consulate, right? And the fact that, embassies are supposed to be protected. This was an embassy complex. It also did damage to a neighboring embassy. So that was the acute situation that prompted this specific reaction from Iran, which was what we saw over the weekend, a telegraphed attack by Iran. Iran had informed officials in Turkey, in Jordan, so that people basically they knew 72 hours in advance that this was going to happen. Plus, they had said it publicly many, many times. And that's one of the reasons why you saw basically all 99% of the drones and missiles being intercepted by mostly the US, but also Israel and help from Jordan. So this particular action by Iran is unprecedented because it is the first time within this shadow war where it's much more in the open, and the first time Iran has actually carried out an attack on Israeli soil. That's why I think we see this heightened level of tensions, but also to keep in mind that the context in which all of this is happening right now is within the larger context of the war on Gaza, right? Israel's war on Gaza, and why the idea that Israel would want to sort of distract from that, which in certain ways it's been successful at doing, by creating this posture of defense now with Iran's attack, and distracting from its actual campaign in Gaza, which is the larger reason why we have so much tension in the region to begin with.
It's quite stunning the way Israel goes around killing people, facing no condemnation, no consequences. As you mentioned, Iranian scientists, which is pretty scary that they're just allowed to do that. I guess it shouldn't be surprising by now. But you always have a interesting critique of the media's representation of the news. So let's take a look at a tweet that you wrote as you watch Western media cover Iran's retaliatory attack as a major escalation and the fear of a larger war. Remember, this is how they covered Israel's embassy attack that prompted the retaliation. International norms don't work if you apply them selectively. You have a screenshot of the New York Times, which wrote, and its headline, Israel bombed an Iranian embassy complex. Is that allowed? Israel can likely argue that its actions did not violate international law protections for diplomatic missions, experts say.
The fact that it's being posed as a question, is bombing an embassy complex allowed? The easiest way to recognize the double standard with which the media portrays things is to just reverse the language. after the Iranian response, there was another Economist headline which started out with Iran attacks Israel, right? A very not using a passive voice, just very direct.
A lot of agency.
And then it said something to the effect of, risking the escalation of like a regional war. That is not the same way that Israel's action was described. That Israel's action by bombing an Iranian consulate or embassy complex could risk, especially in this context, a much larger war, an escalation, that it was a significant escalation. And when US officials were asked this by press in press briefings multiple times, well, is this not an escalation? Of course, they avoided saying it. They said, well, we have to see what was going on. We have to see, was it even a consulate? Like everything becomes questioned.
We actually have a clip of Matthew Miller being asked why it's so hard to determine whether Israel's bombing of an Iran consulate was actually the bombing of an Iran consulate. Let's take a look at this clip.
Have you guys decided yet or made a determination about whether what Israel hit in Damascus was a diplomatic facility or not?
We have not.
So how long is this going to take?
I can't answer that question. We're continuing to look into it. I don't have a timetable, but it's something that
you need to.
We need to gather enough information that will allow us to make an actual determination.
You have no one on the ground in Syria.
We have arranged, as I said to you.
Remember, Syria, it was in Damascus, Syria, which is where the consulate was attacked, just to remind people. Yeah.
When the last time you engaged with me on this question, we have a range of abilities, a range of ways to gather information. They're partner countries of ours who are on the ground. We have intelligence capabilities, obviously, and we're continuing to gather information, but we've not yet been able to make a determination.
I get it, but you were pretty quick into condemning the the invasion of the Mexican embassy in Ecuador.
That was a very clear, well-established embassy.
And this is not very clear where they blew up.
This is something that is taking a little bit more time.
No one died in that incident.
But that's not the question. The question was, was it an embassy or a consulate or not? And it was very clear.
How hard is it to figure that out?
In the case of the Mexican, it's something that we're gathering information
on.
It's
been like 2 weeks.
And we continue to gather information. We don't have a determination.
The Ecuadorian government invaded the Mexican embassy in Ecuador. Nobody was killed, and they rightfully condemned that. But then Iranians are actually killed in this strike, and they can't figure out whether or not it's worthy of condemnation.
A number of people were killed. If I'm not mistaken, there were Syrians that were killed as well. 7
people were killed in that strike on Iran's Syria consulate, including 2 IRGC generals. And here I'm just going to show an image of the strike, just so people get a sense of what it looked like. Here it is.
So this is a pattern. If you watch the briefings, what you'll see is whenever there's like a very obvious thing that Israel did, right? Because we know that Israel carried out an action that is deemed as a violation of international law. The Biden admin, the officials, won't answer the question. What they do is they evade it, doing exactly what you just saw Miller do, which is we're still assessing. And this has been the case with they've been asked now repeatedly about, has Israel violated international law? And you saw a couple weeks ago, John Kirby say, you know what our assessments show? Israel has violated no international law. And they're asked about this over and over again. And the response is there's ongoing assessments. What happens is it falls out of the news cycle, right? There's just ongoing assessments and it falls out of the news cycle. And then the next thing happens and there's ongoing assessments. But we're now more than 6 months into the war. It took the US, I think 10 days, maybe 10 days, to say that Russia was committing war crimes in Ukraine. 10 days. We're now more than 6 months into the war in Gaza, and the US still cannot determine at all if a war crime or a law has been violated by Israel, even though there's so much blatant evidence that this has happened. They've even been asked, well, so are these human rights organizations and other NGOs that are on the ground, do they just not know what they're talking about? Are they all just making this up? And the response is, we're still assessing. And so you see that in this too. It's like, well, we're still assessing. And so there's a way of sort of throwing the question down another week, down another day, until there's a new issue, and then that never comes up again. But immediately on the other side, if Israel does something, well, Israel said so. So that must be fact. It's fact. Israel says it. So the way that it's framed is problematic because if you're not following these things very closely, you might think, well, this attack came out of nowhere. Look, is Israel just being attacked by Iran? And that's not what happened. Something prompted it. On top of that, there was the fact that Iran had said that if the US would allow, basically, if the UN would condemn Israel's action, then no response would be necessary. And again, Matthew Miller, State Department spokesperson, was asked this days before the Iranian response, right? He was asked the specific question, why aren't we just condemning this? And his response was, well, that's a flimsy excuse from Iran. If they don't want to escalate and they don't want to attack them, then they just shouldn't. That's just a decision that they should make.
But the Iranian mission at the UN said that basically if the US, with the Security Council rather, condemned the attack on the consulate in Damascus, this could have, any retaliation could have been avoided. So is this your understanding that actually you don't condemn it because you cannot verify whether it is a diplomatic mission or not? And also, do you think that Israel can go and attack any other diplomatic mission if this is proved to be actually a diplomatic mission and you don't expect any country to retaliate?
So a few things just in order. First of all, I think that's a pretty flimsy excuse from the Iranian government. If they don't want to widen this conflict and they don't want to attack Israel, they don't need permission from anyone else, either at the United Nations, or they just have to make the decision not to do that. And that's the decision that they should make.
But then when the question is posed to him today about Israel's reaction, his response is, well, Israel's a sovereign state. It'll make that decision on its own.
Right. I mean, the double standards could not be more glaring. He would never say about Israel, well, why don't they not escalate? It's up to them to not escalate.
Yeah. Well, they won't even regard it as an escalation, right? It's framed exactly, just like everything else. It's just framed as self-defense. And what you have to assume, and this is sort of like something we have to accept. What you have to assume if you accept the US narrative is that Israel has never done anything wrong. Certainly not intentionally. They may have made a mistake here and there, but even that has no consequences, right? Because they admit their mistakes only when the entire world knows what happened and they're being condemned for it. And Israel's adversaries are always doing something wrong. That's the only way to make it make sense. That 100% Israel is in the right and 0% anyone else has the same right to self-defense. And whether that's a sovereign state like Iran or whether that is the Palestinian people who are occupied, no one has the right to self-defense except for Israel.
Right. And everything they do is self-defense. Yeah. Well, let's take a look at Matthew Miller condemning Iran's actions.
Again, Iran launched an unprecedented air attack on Israel. Ultimately, the defensive effort to intercept Iran's drones and missiles was effective, successfully preventing what could have been a significant loss of life. This was a shared success, and the United States is proud to have played a critical role in it. Over the past 2 days following the attack, the President and the Secretary have consulted extensively with partners in the region and around the world. Secretary Blinken spoke yesterday with the foreign ministers from Egypt, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Germany, and the United Kingdom, and he continues to make calls with foreign counterparts today. We will continue to emphasize the importance that the international community act as a united front in condemning such reckless, escalatory acts. Such behavior threatens to destabilize the region and endangers all its people, and Iran's attack violated the sovereignty of several states in the region. I also want to be absolutely clear. The United States' commitment to Israel's security is sacrosanct. Our contributions to Israel's defense against Iran are a clear manifestation of that commitment. So too are our efforts to advance a ceasefire of at least 6 weeks in Gaza, which would secure the release of all remaining hostages and create a pathway to a more enduring peace. We remain committed to advancing that work and providing lasting peace and security for Israel, for the Palestinian people, and for the broader region. And we will continue to engage regional and international partners urgently on these areas in the coming days.
Wow, they care about sovereignty?
Yeah, almost every sentence he said was ridiculous. Sovereignty being one of them, right? Iran violated sovereignty, but Israel did not violate Syria or Iran's sovereignty when it bombed an embassy complex in Syria. He mentions the coordination with states like Jordan, I think he said Egypt. The Jordanian foreign minister was interviewed by CNN yesterday. And first, he said that Iran had informed them that this attack was going to take place, which is probably what helped them intercept these missiles and drones. What he added, and this was the most significant thing, was that this is not about Iran. This is the Jordanian foreign minister saying this. This is not about Iran. This is about Gaza. Gaza is the focus of what's going on. Gaza is the instability in the region. Something else that Matthew Miller said, right? Iran is destabilizing the region,
right.
Not Israel's genocidal war, but not its bombing of its neighbors, not its bombing of embassies. None of those things are destabilizing, but Iran's response is destabilizing. He talked about the unity of the international community. Laughable. Just the irony of saying that when the US has stood alone against the international community and its wishes for months. It's just so brazen when you look at the language that they use when it's targeting an adversarial state and the language that they use when it's about an ally. Whereas that is not how international law works. That's not how law works, right? Laws don't work that way. If they did, I mean, I would like to say that they don't work that way to a degree. We do see that, but that's what we call corruption, right? If the law does not apply equally to people, it's either prejudice or it's corrupt. And that's what we're looking at in this situation.
I don't know how he manages to say any of this with a straight face. Let's take another look at Matt Miller. Sorry about all this, Matt Miller. I should have offered a trigger warning.
But at a fundamental level, there is a bond between the United States and the people of Israel. And that bond rests on our shared security. And one of the things that we will continue to be committed to is the defense of that security.
And are you willing to risk a regional total war for this?
I think you've heard me say here a number of times that we are working to pursue de-escalation. And that has been the focus of our diplomacy since October 7th, not just over the weekend, but since day one, is trying to pursue de-escalation and prevent the conflict from widening and spreading and expanding.
I mean, the idea that you're pursuing de-escalation while not supporting a ceasefire, right? Because what's creating de-escalation is an ongoing, I have a difficult time even calling it a war, but like an ongoing
war.
Slaughter in Gaza. So you have this genocidal campaign, and then you're saying, even in that statement that we saw previously, he said, we're advocates of a ceasefire, but small print, only 6 weeks, right? These temporary pauses that they're now framing as ceasefires, because when the international community is calling for a ceasefire, what they're asking for is a permanent one, right? They're saying the only way, I mean, the amount of destruction that has been, that Gaza has endured, to rebuild that, and this was a report from several weeks ago, so every day it gets worse. But that report said it would take something like a decade, more than a decade, and tens of billions of dollars to recover, for Gaza to recover. The idea that a 6-week pause is going to do anything, is going to make any dent in what is happening to the people there is ludicrous. And so the way that it's talked about, we've always pursued de-escalation. If you wanted to pursue de-escalation, you would have supported a ceasefire. If you wanted to support de-escalation, you'd stop giving weapons to Israel. And if you wanted to support de-escalation, you'd condition something, condition weapons, condition military aid, condition something on signs that Israel's actually trying to de-escalate, not that it's still carrying out atrocities today, this morning. Today, there was reports of more children slaughtered by an Israeli missile from a drone hitting a playground, hitting a place, a group of kids playing. You
have to hit playgrounds. It's self-defense. That's all. To hit kids at a playground.
That's today. But that's not what's going to be talked about today. What's going to be talked about today is, what is Israel's response to Iran going to be? That's what's going to be talked about today. Not the fact that more children, in addition to the thousands upon thousands of children that have been killed, that doesn't get the same amount of attention.